You don't understand me. You are not expected to. You are not capable of. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within us all. That's it.
The headlines called him evil. The media called him satanic. The public called him a monster. But psychology asks a harder question. How does a human being fracture into something capable of this level of violence? Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, into an environment defined by instability, fear, and violence. From an early age, he was exposed to physical aggression and intimidation, conditions that shape the nervous system long before a child understands language. His father was reportedly physically and emotionally abusive. His mother, while present at times, was inconsistent, leaving Richard to navigate confusion and neglect. Psychological research shows that when children grow up in unpredictable or violent homes, their brains adapt for survival, not safety. Hypervigilance replaces trust. Fear becomes familiar. But what set Richard's development further off course was early desensitization to extreme violence, not through media, but through lived experience, directly and repeatedly. When violence is normalized during brain development, it can blunt empathy, distort boundaries, and wire arousal to danger. This doesn't create a killer by itself, but it severely damages emotional regulation and moral development. His cousin was a defining influence on his youth. When Richard was just 12, Miguel, a Vietnam veteran, showed him graphic photos of war crimes involving sexualized brutality. 3 years later, Richard witnessed Miguel fatally shoot his wife. Rather than experiencing trauma, he reportedly viewed the murder with fascination, signaling a profound and early desensitization that left an indelible mark on his young mind. In trauma psychology, this is known as premature exposure, when a developing brain is forced to process adult-level horror before it has the emotional architecture to contain it. This kind of exposure can severely distort sexual development, fuse arousal with fear, erode empathy, and normalize domination and harm. This does not create violence on its own, but it rewires perception. When violence becomes familiar, the brain stops reacting to it as abnormal. Beyond his environment, Richard also dealt with significant neurological vulnerabilities. Several head injuries led to the development of temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition research links to impaired impulse control, emotional volatility, and dissociation. It can also result in hypersexuality and an altered fear response, factors that deeply distort his perception and emotional regulation. While neurology does not remove moral responsibility or dictate behavior, it can lower the threshold for extreme reactions under the pressure of stress or drugs. By the end of his childhood, the combination of trauma and biological vulnerability had planted the seeds of violence. His obsession with power had already begun to manifest. This intersection of trauma and brain injury leads to a debated question. Was Richard Ramirez a psychopath or a sociopath? While these terms are often used interchangeably, the distinction is vital to understanding his behavior. Richard reportedly scored exceptionally high on the PCLR, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, a tool used to measure traits like a lack of remorse and superficial charm. However, his profile was complex. Traditional psychopaths, like Ted Bundy, are often calculated and emotionally cold. Ramirez, by contrast, was volatile and prone to spontaneous emotional outbursts, traits more commonly associated with sociopathy. While psychopathy is often seen as innate or biological, a sociopath is often manufactured by their environment. In Richard's case, it was likely a perfect storm of both. When asked about his own capacity for feeling, Richard once cryptically remarked,
"Even psychopaths have emotions if you dig deep enough, but then again, maybe they don't."
When the interviewer followed up by asking if he had emotions, his only response was,
"No comment."
As Richard entered adolescence, his life spiraled further into instability. He began experimenting with alcohol and drugs. But for him, these substances weren't about recreation. They were a sanctuary. They offered a temporary erasure of a world that had never felt safe, providing emotional anesthesia and a way to suppress the memories of his childhood. While these substances numbed his pain, they also amplified his neurological instability, fueling paranoia and a growing detachment from reality. Living on the fringes of society, Richard absorbed the chaos of his environment. It was during this time that he became deeply immersed in the occult. For Richard, Satanism wasn't just about dark symbolism. It was a vehicle for freedom and power in a life that had granted him neither. By identifying with the figure of ultimate rebellion, he could finally assert control over a world that had consistently marginalized and degraded him. In psychology, this is known as counter-identification. It is a common defense mechanism in severely traumatized individuals who construct an identity around dominance to combat an overwhelming sense of helplessness. By the time he reached adulthood, the combination of early abuse, neurological impairment, and chronic substance use had created a perfect storm. It didn't make his later actions inevitable, but it made him a high-risk fuse waiting for a spark.
This trial is a joke, though.
Between 1984 and 1985, Richard embarked on a series of violent crimes across California. Burglary, robbery, assault, and murder became his methods. But it's crucial to understand the context. Many of his early crimes were burglaries driven primarily by the need to feed his drug addiction and survive. The acts escalated over time, reflecting a combination of impulse and distorted coping mechanisms shaped by years of trauma. The murders he committed were terrifying, but they were not random acts of abstract evil. They were committed by a man who had been exposed to brutality, fear, and chaos his entire life. Unlike cases driven by survival or family entrapment, Richard's crimes align with predatory compulsive violence. This type of violence is characterized by control over victims, emotional detachment, dissociation during acts, and power as the central motivator. Importantly, this violence is not rooted in hatred or ideology, but in dominance and control, often tied to earlier powerlessness. Again, this explains the psychology. It does not excuse the harm. August 31st, 1985 changed everything. Richard was captured by civilians in East Los Angeles after being identified from media coverage. His arrest brought relief to the city, but also unleashed a media frenzy. The trial, which began in 1988, was a spectacle. Months of testimony, media scrutiny, and public fascination reduced a life to fear, darkness, and headlines. Satanism, the occult, his crimes, everything was amplified. The nuances of a broken child turned adult were drowned out by the shock and horror. Yet, glimpses emerged. Through testimony, interviews, and media coverage, the world briefly saw the person behind the monster. A man molded by circumstance, pain, and unaddressed vulnerabilities, whose life might have taken a different path if he had received proper guidance, protection, and unconditional support. Richard spent nearly 3 decades on death row in California. In 2013, he died of natural causes, complications of B-cell lymphoma. He left behind a story both terrifying and tragic. His legacy is complex, and his story continues to provoke debate and reflection. To some, he remains the embodiment of fear. Some remember the terror he inflicted. To others, his story is a case study of trauma, neglect, and the human mind pushed to the extremes. Richard Ramirez's life reminds us of the delicate balance between environment, trauma, and human choice. With early intervention, love, and care, he might have grown differently. A man with a fractured mind, but a life spared from violence.
I don't care about myself, really. I don't care about what happens to me. I never did, really.
Are there any things about you you'd want to be remembered for? Things that are positive in you, things that you think are special?
I survived as best as I could.